Liberalism, section. The Liberal Revolution as a tangle of emancipation and disemancipation. Once the field of hagiography has been evacuated, in reconstructing the history of liberalism, it is better to start with the slogan advanced by the rebel American colonists, quote, "We won't be their Negroes." On the one hand, the rebellion began by demanding equality, while on the other it reasserted inequality and further deepened it. The two demands were indissolubly linked. Precisely because they established a marked superiority over blacks and Indians, the colonists felt themselves completely equal to gentlemen and property owners residing in London, and demanded that such equality be recognized and consecrated at every level. The dialectic that issued in the Glorious Revolution was not very different. We have seen an exponent of English proto-liberalism demanding, in the face of interference by monarchical power, peaceful enjoyment of his own possessions and servants. Far from questioning it, quote, "true liberty consecrated the existing relations of service, and, in the colonies, slavery, as belonging to an inviolable private sphere. The equality property owners demanded with the sovereign, who could now be nothing but primus inter pares, went hand in hand with the reification of servants, who tended to be likened to other objects of property. That is why liberalism and racial chattel slavery emerged together in a twin birth. At this point, we should analyze as a whole the three revolutions from which we started out. Of the first, which occurred in Holland, Huizinga observed that, quote, "The revolt against the Spanish government was a conservative revolution and could not have been otherwise." End quote. The same conclusion has been reached by other eminent historians. Philip II was concerned to, quote, "require that bishops be technically skilled, that is, theologians, rather than sons of great lords," and was opposed to the nobility's attempt to transform the Council of State into an exclusively aristocratic executive body. End quote. We can then understand that, quote, "large parts of the Netherlands nobility were suddenly afraid that the prince was not their agent, that his policies would, in the short and medium run, threaten their interests significantly." End quote. So on the one hand, we have Philip II, who surrounded himself with, quote, "secretaries who were generally from modest origins, passive instruments of his will." On the other, an oligarchic, princely republic of communal cities and feudal lordships, a grand aristocracy, a feudal oligarchy, engaged in defending, quote, "privileges and customs that consecrated its power and prestige." It is as if the nobles of the Netherlands, like large English property owners, and the English colonists in America subsequently, declared, quote, "We don't want to be treated as your servants." End quote. In its initial stages, the revolt against Philip II was not very different from the contemporaneous agitation of the Fronde in France. In both cases, what ignited the powder was the clash between the high nobility's autonomist and, in some sense, liberal aspirations, and the crown's centralizing tendencies. Except that, in the second case, the influence of the struggle for national independence and the intervention of the popular masses in it profoundly altered the initial picture. We have already seen the impetus given by the Glorious Revolution to the slave trade and the development of racial slavery in the colonies. The aspect of disemancipation also emerges with clarity in Ireland. Systematic expropriation of the natives intensified. In 1688, Catholics still owned 22% of Irish land, but the figure fell to, quote, 14% in 1703 and a mere 5% in 1778. End quote. And that is not all. Quote, Catholics, the overwhelming majority of the Irish population, were excluded from all public offices and from the legal profession." End quote. In England itself, the Glorious Revolution swept away the obstacles that still stood in the way of enclosures. As Marx put it, having attained full control of power, landowners and capitalists, quote, inaugurated the new era by practicing on a colossal scale the thefts of state lands, which had hitherto been managed more modestly. End quote. To the extent that rural laborers had found an ear more or less attentive to their lamentations, it was from the Stuart monarchy. Up to 1688, by dint of the control over them exercised from above, justices of the peace had some autonomy from the landed aristocracy. They subsequently lost it, becoming, quote, virtual dictators of local government, and answering only to the members of their own class who sat in Parliament. Finally, we must not lose sight of the incredible increase in the number of crimes against property that carried the death penalty, with the establishment of a regime of terror over the popular masses. The dimension of disemancipation is even more obvious in the American Revolution. The terms in which Theodore Roosevelt celebrated it at the start of the 20th century are revealing. Beginning of long quote. The chief factor in producing the Revolution, and later in producing the War of 1812, was the inability of the motherland country to understand that the freemen who went forth to conquer a continent should be encouraged in that work. The spread of the hardy, venturesome backwoodsmen was to most of the statesmen of London a matter of anxiety rather than of pride, and the famous Quebec Act of 1774 was in part designed with the purpose of keeping the English-speaking settlements permanently east of the Alleghenies, and preserving the mighty and beautiful valley of Ohio as a hunting ground for savages. End quote. Unquestionably, the tragedy of the Indians was dramatically hastened by the foundation of the United States. Great Britain's interests in its transatlantic possessions were commercial rather than territorial. And, as we know, it was Loyalists who had taken refuge in Canada who accused the insurgents of a systematic policy of genocide. If Indians gained nothing from the American Revolution, what about blacks? The foundation of the United States involved the advent of a racial state and an unprecedented consolidation of racial chattel slavery. It is true that, in line with the watchword of the struggle against political slavery, advanced during the revolt against Britain, the northern states abolished slavery in the strict sense. But blacks did not thereby acquire freedom, confined as they were to a caste different from that of freemen. In any event, there is a fact that provides food for thought. Britain abolished slavery in its colonies in 1834, while it survived in the United States for another 3 decades. Even the condition of free blacks was worse there, for example, than in Canada. In that British colony between 1850 and 60, 20,000 blacks found refuge who had abandoned the United States, where they feared that laws on the return of fugitive slaves to their legitimate owners might furnish pretexts for the enslavement even of free blacks. But already, some decades earlier, more than 1,000 black slaves had sought refuge in Canada after their delegation had been benevolently received by the local authorities, with a stinging polemic against the United States. Quote, "Tell the Republicans on your side of the line that we Royalists do not know men by their color. Should you come to us, you will be entitled to all the privileges of the rest of His Majesty's subjects." End quote. Obviously, this declaration was not free from an ideological, self-serving element. But it remains the case that blacks in the U.S. looked to Canada as the promised land of liberty. The most significant steps in the expansion of the United States simultaneously sealed the extension of the democracy and domination, in its harshest forms, of the master race. In 1803, Napoleon sold Louisiana. Although already in force, slavery had not yet assumed a clearly racial form. There were 20,000 half-castes, who, to all intents and purposes, were free, and sometimes engaged in the liberal professions. They might even be very wealthy, and thus form a part of the dominant elite. Transfer to the United States involved the consecration of local self-government and the power, in the final analysis, of white property owners, French and Anglo-American. The result was a deterioration in the conditions not only of slaves. Emancipation became increasingly difficult, but above all, of free men of color. Their numbers diminished in absolute terms, and even more appreciably in percentage terms. Their immigration was discouraged, while that of whites was encouraged. Hit by a series of discriminatory measures, free men of color now began to form an intermediate caste closer to slaves than free men proper. In Louisiana, annexed to the United States, the twin birth of free representative bodies and racial chattel slavery was also seen in due course. A new, considerable expansion of U.S. territory occurred some decades later with the drastic amputation of Mexico. We already know about the introduction of slavery into Texas. But even more significant was the tragedy that struck the Indians in both Texas and California. Subjected to forced labor and a thinly disguised slavery, their children, in effect, became res nullius. Particularly desirable were young girls because, as a local paper put it, they served the dual purpose of, quote, work and lust. But this was only one chapter in a horrific story. Quote, the destruction and degradation of the California Indians is one of the sorriest blotches on the honor and intelligence of a nation. It was less a matter of war than of sport. End quote, and end of section.